Let the truck!
You are listening to What the Truck. Welcome back, everybody. It's Monday. I'm Thomas Wasson, filling in as well. Joining me, the very talented, the great Kaylee Nix. We're going to have a wonderful show going on for you today. It is the 14th. A lot of great stuff coming up. Before we begin, though, I'm going to toss it over to Kaylee. She's going to tell us what we're looking at today.
Thomas, that was a really good introduction. Thanks for that. I feel really empowered right here sitting up in this seat. Like, I'm ready to roll. Let's go.
Dude, we're bringing the energy right now.
Happy Monday. It's time to hit it hard. I hope you guys all had a good weekend. It was a pretty busy one in the news cycle, and we're going to get to some of that here in just a second. But Thomas, let's start off by giving a big shout out to our sponsor for the day. Thank you guys to truckstop.com for continually sponsoring this show, and we got a nice little message from them.
Spend less time searching and more time hauling loads with the Truck Stop Load Board. Find the right load at the right time to put more money in your pocket. Learn more today.
All I got to say is that I think I need the guy from the Truck Stop Load Board ad to narrate my life, because he makes me feel empowered too. But
very grizzled voice.
Yeah, very grizzled, very hard, and I love it. Thanks to truckstop.com, guys. If you're ready to move more freight, make more money, and manage your freight business with speed and confidence, look to truckstop.com for tools that transform the way that you move freight. You can learn more at truckstop.com. Thank you guys for continuing to be that sponsor of our show here. Thomas, let's get right into it. We've got another good show on the way. Today we're talking with Craig Segall from Segall Consultants a little bit about what actually happened with the California Air Resources Board, why we've gone from politics to now emissions, and kind of where all of that sits. And, you're our host of Truck Tech. You write a lot about ZEVs. You've done a lot of ZEV work. You've gone and checked out people who are in the ZEV business. So we're going to talk to him a little bit. And then some of the biggest news over last week, we've got split decisions in two different circuit courts now over court cases containing FAAAA, which I'll let Matt Leler explain what that acronym means, because truly I don't really know. But we'll let him talk about F4A, what that means, and how TQL and C.H. Robinson are on opposite sides of the receiving end of decisions. But first, let's get into our headlines for the morning. Thomas, we had more tariffs announced over the weekend, 30% tariffs on imports from Mexico and the EU. And it feels like we just can't ever find a place to land, right? And that's continuing to contribute to a lot of the supply chain uncertainty.
Well, it definitely is. These are negotiating tactics, tariffs. You've got to imagine, in terms of the tariff world, a lot of countries have had tariffs on our goods in order to protect their industries. And so we have not had a lot of tariffs for a long time. 5-10% was the most. And so kicking it up to 30%, there's two ways to negotiate. There's the carrot and then there's the stick. And so, it's like trying to feed a rabbit. And if it doesn't eat it fast enough, you just yell at it and scare it. I think that's kind of where we are right now. We are utilizing the stick. Obviously we'll have to wait and see if they stick around, or if it's going to be an instance of taco where you talk about tariffs and then eventually roll it back. Who knows? But it makes for great headlines, especially for drivers out there. Just understand that, look at these in terms of the broader context of, we want to make a deal with a country and we're going to cause ourselves just as much pain as them until they decide to do something.
And so these new 30% tariffs are slated to go into effect on Mexico and the EU August 1st. And President Trump continuing to cite levels of fentanyl coming into the United States for reasons for instituting these, at least to Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. And as we say, as quickly as this news comes in, it ends up changing, because we also now have news about what's going on with tariffs from a tomato standpoint. And tomato, right? You're throwing tomatoes at these tariffs. But now a historic 15-year-old agreement with Mexico on tomato prices is being rolled back. So folks, if you don't have tomato plants in your garden already, maybe you should buy them, or you'll be out of luck when it comes to making your pico de gallo.
The hipsters at the Whole Foods will be up in arms, because it turns out that tomatoes are a big deal. So build your victory garden.
It's been so hot here in Chattanooga. I planted 6 tomato plants this year, and every single one of them died. And I can't lie, as a first-year gardener, I had some really high hopes, and I did not have my efforts thwarted by tomato horned worms like I would have thought, but by the southeastern heat. And I don't know which is worse.
I can't even keep a succulent alive, so I completely feel your pain.
Well, go ahead and go on over to freightwaves.com to find more information about tariffs and what's going on there. That's your most up-to-date source for what's going on with the tariff world. Nori Mahoney gets those articles out just about as quickly as President Trump sends those articles and those letters out to the countries that we are putting tariffs on. Let's move on to our second headline of the morning. We've got news from a new ZEV program announced in the Pacific Northwest. Thomas, this is your handiwork writing. Talk to us a little bit about the Northwest Seaport Alliance.
Well, it's a combination, part of a larger grant. Zeem Solution was selected as one of the many, and they're working on building out charging infrastructure and helping EV fleets. So this is the Port of Tacoma. You think of SeaTac as one of the larger ones on the Pacific Northwest. And it's kind of a bigger deal as these chargers are popping up. You got to imagine for some of these trucks that want to get the longer ranges, we're seeing the very early stages. This is like watching when the railroads are coming out and they're trying to like combine them across the coast. And so it's a really, really cool story. When we're looking at it from listeners and drivers, one of the big things you need to think about is long haul and EVs are not there yet. ZEV, zero emissions vehicles, just because of range and weight. But for shorter haul applications, thinking of drayage and yard dogs, which the Noble Yard Dog has been like EV since like 2017.
Yeah, there you go.
These are really good opportunities because you run your shift, you kind of charge it when you're on your break, take a lunch break, plug it into the charger. And so we are going to continue to see rollouts, very limited, but this is one of those things we're keeping an eye on the pulse, keeping an eye on the news. It's really fascinating stuff. I got to drive one. It's like a golf cart. They're super, super fun, but they're a little too expensive for me. It costs about 2 times as much as my house right now. So we are working on that TCO.
When you put it in reverse, does it make that weird noise? It's like almost like a hollow sounding, like a humming. You know what I'm talking about? You ever heard that in a ZEV?
Oh, those are called parasitic. It's not parasitic emissions, but parasitic draw. Sometimes they make weird noises.
Yes.
It doesn't
Okay.
have a transmission. Sometimes they have like 2 versions of transmission, like tortoise and hare, but they wouldn't let me back one up. I only got to drive them forward, which is very nice of them on the test track. We got to haul some stuff around up in PACCAR at their innovation center. I need to ask them about backing up. And the other one you ask about is, can it stay on a hill without rolling back?
Yeah.
Those are the 2 big things for electric.
I had a Barbie Jeep when I was growing up, and it also had a tortoise and a hare setting, but it did, in fact, have a semi-4-wheel drive, and then it had a reverse. Barbie Jeep's the original ZEVs, the original battery-powered trucks. We're going to talk a little bit more about ZEVs with our first guest coming up here in just a little bit. But Thomas, let's finish off our headlines for today because we've got new legislation introduced last week that would require the FMCSA to accept positive hair drug test results into the agency's Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. This has been a hot point of contention for a while because we all know that we do have Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse for when it comes to randomized drug testing, for urine samples, for things that pop on a regular basis. But hair follicle testing has been this kind of do we, don't we, because it shows habitual drug use.
Yep.
And it shows drugs that are in your system for a longer period of time and could allow for a more stringent crackdown on people who do use drugs frequently. Talk to me a little bit about this from the fleet standpoint, right? This is coming and being announced, being backed by the Trucking Alliance. It's being sponsored by the U.S. Representative Rick Crawford out of Arkansas, and it's coming at it from a legislative perspective versus a regulatory perspective, which is different.
Yep. So there's a lot of ways to get things passed. So the FMCSA and the DOT can make rulemaking. That normally takes a few years. Congress can mandate by telling the agency, this is what we're seeing right now, saying you need to do this, and that's the fastest way. Or the chief executive, like President Trump, could tell the DOT secretary, hey, I want this. This is important. And that's another way to speed it up. So looking at it from a fleet standpoint, it's a battle of big fleets versus small fleets.
This is being sponsored by JB Hunt and by Knight Swift.
Yeah, look, think of the largest carriers because right now, I'm pretty certain they already do it. They want to have more extensive testing because they have more rigorous driver vetting. That's why when we talked about English language proficiency, the large fleets, when I talked with trucking associations, they were like, look, this wasn't really on our radar because we already had to do this for like 20 years. We got like self-certify. So you always see this dichotomy. So yeah, for the large fleet standpoint, this is going to be a big deal if they can make the smaller fleets. If it goes in the clearinghouse, you used to be able to get certain drugs and it's out of your system in 72 hours. Well, the hair follicle is a way to catch you doing the other stuff you shouldn't be doing. So think of that in terms of a larger one. If you do get in the clearinghouse, they will not let you get your, if you lose your license, you're trying to get it again and you have it, you got to go through a corrective action course. You got to go through all this extra stuff. So when we're thinking of this kind of legislation, expect it to have a outsized impact on smaller fleets and owner-operators who either do not have the resources or the ability or time to jump through all these hoops compared to the mega fleets, which have armies and legions of compliance folks.
And if you're a small owner operator, small fleet who's worried about this impacting you, head on over to freightwaves.com/the-playbook to learn all about the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, what it takes to stay compliant, and how to make sure that you are unaffected by those regs. You can find all of those headlines up on freightwaves.com. Go give them a read. Thomas, before we get to our guests for the day, I got two really cool tweets that I wanted to show you in. We saw Craig Fuller start to riff on about this. It seems that tariffs, and according to Adobe Digital Prices in June 2025, we end up seeing tariffs are a little bit more deflationary than we thought. So if you're not following Craig on Twitter, you want to make sure that you go ahead and grab that, because it's an interesting perspective in some double-digit price changes. Some data showing that computers are actually down 10% year over year.
It's part of a larger trend, and I heard this at the Daimler Investor Day. This like best country of origin or most favored country. These large corporations aren't dumb. They're going to move around. So if you start tariffing like China, for instance, or you start putting tariffs on other ones, they are going to work on trying to find places that are just as cheap. Labor is like moving around. And so in regards to tariffs being deflationary, you've got to imagine a lot of these companies have secondary, tertiary suppliers, and those suppliers want to gain market share. So it's part of this larger trend where yes, certain things will get more expensive, but other things will get less expensive because of just how interconnected and crazy our supply chain world is. The only downside is when you're looking at raw materials is when tariffs can really hurt.
Yeah.
I talked with them about steel and aluminum, and it turns out that the U.S. suppliers, whenever we raised them on like China and other countries, the domestic ones were like, oh, so you're going up 30%? I'm going to raise my prices 25. So then, when we're thinking of inflationaries, but, it was told me something like maybe like $3,000-4,000 extra dollars on a truck. So it's still a chunk.
Yeah.
But don't worry about the doom scrollers and the doom postings. We have a very, very complicated supply chain. So I love these little surprise things like what Craig was pointing out with that. It's not all doom and gloom. It just depends on what, you need.
And it'll be interesting to see when our big retailers end up giving us their pricing data as well, what ends up happening there for real. So, all right, let's move into our guest for the day. Starting these off with Craig Segall. Craig, thank you so much for joining us here on the show on What the Truck this morning. Talk to us a little bit about what you do and why you're here to talk about ZEVs and what's going on in the zero emission space right now.
Well, sure. So I'm the former Deputy Executive Officer of the California Air Board. So the past years of discussion on zero emission truck rules comes out of rules my ex-team set. I also negotiated the California Clean Truck Partnership, which obviously is in the news lately. These days, I help support a bunch of different foundations, academics, NGOs on electrification. So I'm working in policy consulting. And I guess I'm here to explore with you where we stand. It has been a wild time for the regulatory side of this picture. So I want to talk about that and what's happening as we start losing a lot of federal support for zero emission trucks and what that means for fleets and drivers.
Yeah, it's been quite the interesting time because as we've seen a really, really massive pivot from the policies of the previous administration, priorities of the previous administration to what has come in now over the last 5 to 6 months. And California Air Resources Board, the legislation that has passed, the state rules that have gone back and forth have been in those headlines a lot. Talk to us, give us just a little bit of background on where you guys started, what was in place, and now what's happened over the last 5 months with the rollback.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, of course, I'm just speaking for myself rather than my former team, but of course, lived and breathed this for a decade. Basically, where we're sitting is the state figured out a while ago that it could really lead electrification, and it had to. You spend some time along the freight corridors out of Port Valley, Long Beach, or in San Joaquin. You're dealing with massive amounts of asthma, cancer rates are high, air quality sucks. Also, major fuel costs associated with what had been a really aging fleet of diesels. So what the state began doing was a set of rules, an omnibus rule, which is basically clean up smog coming out of the tailpipes, and then a suite of rules, advanced clean trucks, advanced clean fleets, to try to electrify as much of the fleet as possible, and a bunch of money. So in my time, there's about a $10 billion state commitment going into incentives for drivers and fleets to electrify. The Inflation Reduction Act built on all that. A lot of that was authorized by the feds, and of course, in the last few months, we've seen a collapse of a lot of that program. We saw that coming. So the other piece I should highlight just from the jump is we've been through this before. In Trump 1, we saw a lot of similar back and forth, and I helped do deals with the car industry to agree to just stay the course regardless of what happens in the courts or in Congress. Did a similar deal with basically all the big OEMs agreeing that they'd stay the course on cleaner truck provision, at least in Cali, going forward. And what we're seeing, though, on all this front is both this political back and forth that could undermine the deal, with some of the makers, Daimler, Volvo, equivocating whether they stay in, and also some difficult market behaviors. So for me, the core of this story is the state's been trying to stay caught up with our adversaries and competitors in China, where we have massive electrification, in Europe, et cetera, trying to deliver public health benefits, trying to deliver fuel cost savings. But we have not seen this market respond in the way one might have hoped. So we've seen some cost increases on some models and some classes of trucks, especially in states that had these rules. We've seen unusual practices where people were bundling sales that made it harder for fleets to access them. So we've seen rollbacks and pressure. And to me, the question's going to be now, we still have a deal. We have a need probably for future rules. But what we really have now is a disconnect between what's going on in the US market, where we're still seeing this sort of tethering to diesel, and global markets, where we're seeing people sprint really quickly towards zero emission trucks. So what I've got my eye on is what happens to Daimler, what happens to Volvo. Do they decide to keep accelerating in the US market, provide really affordable, large quantities of zero emission trucks, maybe especially medium duty spaces? Or do we see a market pullback that winds up stranding a lot of the freight system in diesel, which for California, for where I live, would mean both lots more fuel costs on the system for years and years, but also a lot more health impacts for kids and old folks living near the highways. And that's all to balance right now. It's going to turn because we don't have a legal pressure on those companies right now, and whether they stand by their deal on that partnership and whether they change their marketing and product planning strategies to start responding to the competitors who are coming up behind them.
I actually can answer some of that. I was at the Daimler Capital Markets Day last week, and we asked them
Yes.
about that. Because of the uncertainty, and they also are in the same boat, like you said, they don't know. They made this commitment. They signed it up. The wording of it's like, well, if any California worded it in such a way that like, well, if it goes away, you guys still kind of do it. So it's on pause, but they looked at the European market as the growth opportunity now for the space. There were concerns eventually that it's almost like a bifurcation of the global markets. They're like, look, we're going to keep making diesel engines. We are hitting pause in terms of our ZEV efforts in the US market until something settles and we get a little bit more signal. And then at the same time, Europe is viewed as a growth play because the EVs are more expensive, but also the regulatory and political capital is there to make it happen. So I had a few questions here with you because I know that for some drivers and listeners and myself, there's a lot of acronyms. So we have the omnibus for smog. California's in a bowl. Being in Chattanooga, I can relate. We were a very smoggy city before they emission tested. We have the advanced clean truck, the advanced clean fleets, and then we had Congress pull back one, but one still there and waivers. Tell us a very high level, what kind of went and what kind of stayed? Because as I understand it, I guess the amount of your total fleet was on the chopping block that needed to be emissions, but some of the emission stuff through like 27 or up into a certain year date, they wanted more stringent. Kind of catch us up on that, because that was the biggest sticking point for me trying to figure this out, was all of these acronyms and how is that going to impact some of these fleets?
Yeah, it can be a bit of a soup. The way I'd think about it if I was a fleet owner, basically, is that right now the state cannot enforce its law requiring increasing numbers of zero-emission trucks in your fleet. That was the Advanced Clean Fleet rule. Advanced Clean Trucks, which is increasing numbers of OEM sales, is baked into this deal the OEMs did with California. So that we should keep seeing more sales of those trucks. On Omnibus, which was smog, the state rule is on hold, but it was heavily aligned with the federal rule, which is still on the books, and compliant engines are still rolling out from the OEMs. So I think the picture, so when I look at it from a fleet manager standpoint, is there's a question about OEM behavior here. A lot of the legal pressure to increase zero-emission trucks, that will come back. The state still has its authority. It still has this problem. It still wants to be competitive globally. But it's a few years out now. And so there's a positioning question. And hearing you point out Daimler, the fleets, I was also watching that set of conversations. That's really where my head's at, honestly. Because for a typical buyer, right, you probably don't have transparency into your competitors' pricing arrangements with the OEMs, which is a big problem in this market. And you're trying to figure out where to go. I think there's really good arguments. The TCO for zero-emission trucks crosses over with diesel within the next 3 or 4 years. Already has in some use cases, will even for the heavies. And so the question now from a buyer perspective is, how long do you stay sunk in diesel? And that turns in turn on, does Daimler keep dawdling? Does Volvo view this as where they dump their internal combustion engines through the 2030s while all the other markets grow? Or do they look at this deal they did with California, stick to it, which I think they legally have to, honestly, and keep investing here? And that's a conversation, right? Because if you're thinking about, say, product planning in your fleet for 10 years, you probably don't want to go heavy on diesel right now. You know these mandates are going to come back. You know that the next president, or maybe this president, looks across the Pacific and sees that we have a freight system that's increasingly isolated, with older tech, especially 5, 10 years down the line, if we keep on this trajectory. That's not a great position to be in. And so one question I have is, one, how do the manufacturers come to the table and not write this off, instead see this as a chance to grow into these markets now? And how can states, how can private investors and others help both support early acting fleets that bought these EV trucks and can help keep that growing, whether that's through better debt financing, insurance guarantees, resale guarantees, use zero emission trucks compete with used diesels in the latter. But we're in a space where company behavior, especially of the big truck makers, and having them actually recognize that the world is changing and not leave the US behind really matters. And the last thing I'll say is, to me, I've been in this for a long time. Some of what I'm seeing from Daimler and Volvo reminds me of how the US light-duty OEMs behaved when they were confronted with Japanese competition in the 80s and 90s. You sort of assume that you can sort of leave the market and older technology and that you're always going to have the same market share. I think that's a lousy bet if you've got Chinese makers who are rapidly commercializing zero-emission trucks. I think there was something like 250,000 zero-emission vehicles in medium heavy duty in China just this last year sold. Would I bet on Daimler? If I'm Daimler, do I bet on the US market staying behind and American drivers never wanting access to better tech? I don't. So I think slowing down on their edge, I get it. We're all trying to manage uncertainty. But I would be trying to protect my long-term market share and trajectory. So if I'm a fleet, I think I'm trying to figure out ways to keep getting into zero emission, perhaps a little more cautiously. If I'm a government, I'm looking for ways to support that, given my needs. And if I have one of these big OEMs, honestly, I'd be looking over my shoulder at what's coming up behind me across the world market.
That's a good point. Is the rest of the world is gaining on the United States from a technology perspective, and that's not a statement that's up for debate. That is in fact a fact, and I think it's going to take a little bit of almost a fear of falling behind or a fear of missing out. But the fact that we are so aggregated and so isolated in the United States, and we don't have to have that inter-country connectivity like we do across Europe, is something to watch. Craig, thank you for joining us here for the show today. For people who want to get in contact with you and figure out a little bit about where we go from here next, where can people do that?
Well, Craig at SegalConsults.com, or just drop me a line on LinkedIn. I'm annoyingly omnipresent and glad to be here.
Awesome, Craig. Thank you so much for joining us. Head on over there. And you know what? For folks who also want to learn a little bit more about ZEVs and where people are going with their headspace manufacturers, check out Truck Tech.
Yeah. Craig, shoot me some data next time you're working on it. Happy to put it in the newsletter. You're completely right. I'm kind of wondering if we're going to see a Sputnik moment when we realize China and their ZEV is really, really rapidly fast, and we may get caught, very unaware soon.
Exactly right. Holy shit is a reasonable reaction from these guys. So we'll see where it goes.
I agree. All right, Craig, thank you so much for joining us here. Thomas, let's check out Meanwhile, because we got a video that shows you should always read the signs when you're going underneath where you're going. Check it out. Ay is the appropriate reaction to that. It tells you there's a low clearance. You back up and then you try and go slightly forward again. It's like can opener status there. It's a little too much off the top, A
little too much on the haircut. Let's just say that they're not going to get a 20% tip after that haircut up there. That happens. What's crazy is that
it happens so often.
Oh, yeah. So when you're looking at either one of three things, if I'm looking at this as a fleet manager, one, were you using an off-the-shelf GPS instead of a truck GPS? Because that happened to me so many times. So you'll see, listeners, you're seeing a video of an 18-wheeler in an overhanging bridge, and it's just backing forwards and backwards while shaving the top off of its sleeper cab. That happens a lot. Sometimes the drivers aren't paying attention. You think you've got it. Surprisingly, it looks like they tried to stop, because usually I've seen it where they'll take the whole top off the trailer as well.
The trailer too, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot off of the top.
It's like a cornucopia popping open.
Always check your directions before you go. That happens down here right in Chattanooga all the time. We've got some low railroad crossings. And again, it's there. It's listed. Read the road signs, people.
Northeast is just as bad too. That's why drivers really don't like the Northeast. They just put it there for fun, just to mess with people. It is evil. Maniacally evil. Thank you, 1850s, for making bridges too low.
There you go. Exactly. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our next guest. We've got Matt Leffler here joining us, the armchair attorney, here in the red blazer. Matt, I love the look. You look fab.
Love to look good for you guys. How are we doing? Happy Monday. We made it. They said it couldn't be done, but we did it.
We sure did. We're doing a lot better than what's going on in the broker space right now because the two groups, TQL and C.H. Robinson, they may be at odds, broker competition. They're also at odds now in these lawsuits. We've got two conflicting views. The courts are split. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on.
What we are watching unfold right now is the most important case when it relates to broker liability. The idea is, can a broker be held responsible for the negligence of a motor carrier? It's no longer just a break between the Ninth Circuit and the Seventh Circuit. Now we have 4 circuits that have all weighed in, 2 of them on each side. You have the 7th and the 11th against the 9th and the 6th. This is the moment for the Supreme Court of the United States to finally take up a case on F4A preemption. We need clarity. This is the most important case for brokers in the country right now.
I said this in the intro. Clarify what F4A means because I don't know the full acronym for it, but talk to us a little bit about what that is.
So F4A, it's an aviation statute, but it has to do with regulation of our industry. Generally speaking, brokers cannot be held responsible for the motor carrier's negligence. The F4A statute's all about price, route, and service. The broker is an intermediary. They never take control of the freight. They never take possession of the freight. All they do is coordinate the shipper with the motor carrier. But there's this big looming question. When you look at this statute, you get different outcomes. The same words are looked at by different judges in different appellate courts, and they come to different conclusions. What we see happening with F4A right now is if you are a motor carrier and you have an accident, you're going to get sued. Absolutely. But they're also going to sue the broker. And in some jurisdictions, some circuits, if you're the broker, you simply say F4A preempts you from suing me and you get out of the lawsuit. That's what's happened in the 7th Circuit. That's what's happened in the 11th Circuit. But now you have this conflict where just because the motor carrier had something terrible happen and some horrifying set of facts take place, they're looking at the broker and saying, you should have known. It's your fault that this motor carrier is here at all. And because of that, you're also at fault. And that is something that most brokers do not understand. And we now have 14 states, or is it, if we have a total of 13 states right now in this country that if you're a broker, you can be held liable for the negligence of a motor carrier. That is something we cannot have. We must have the Supreme Court weigh in on this case.
And, I always like touching base with you, Matt, on these conversations because you have such good analogies. One of the fun ones you told me a year ago when we were talking about this was the Supreme Court really likes to wait till it starts bubbling up, till it starts really breaking. Where are we at right now? It sounds like a 4-way cage match between the 6th, the 5th, the almighty 9th, and the 7th. What are we looking at? Who are our two combatants? Who's the Floyd and the Tyson or the Mayweather? And what do you think SCOTUS is going to, what's kind of our timeline to think about for this? Is it going to kind of stew for a little bit? We're going to see some more appellate court rulings and then comes up? Or do you think we're going to see, by the end of this year, for people who are wondering the timeline, give us a little bit of a rundown here.
My suspicion is that this has percolated enough. And I love to say the word percolate, the idea that we're going to let the federal courts feel it out, get some movement, get some interpretation. I think we will have SCOTUS take up one of these F4A preemption cases, maybe the Cox case in the 6th Circuit, but I'm really keeping my eye on the C.H. Robinson case in the 7th. What is so remarkable about the C.H. Robinson case is that C.H. Robinson won. They won at the 7th Circuit. The people who sued them appealed to the Supreme Court asking for permission. You don't just get to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. You petition for certiorari. But unlike Global Trans in the Yee case just a few years ago, where Global Trans said, Supreme Court, don't take this case up. We already won. We're done with this. Robinson did something that is incredibly valuable for the industry. Robinson said, Supreme Court, we understand that we won at the 7th Circuit, but we are asking you to please take this case up. Robinson does business in all of the states. And this is something that many brokers also do, business in all of the states. And we need clarity. So my belief, if I'm reading these tea leaves, and I do love reading tea leaves, I think we have the Supreme Court grab one of these cases, maybe consolidate them, maybe consolidate the 6th Circuit case with the 7th Circuit case. They will look at this and they will say that the 7th Circuit is right. brokers are not going to be held liable for the negligence of a motor carrier. That's my belief fundamentally. I think we see that. As for timing, Thomas, I don't know. I would love to see them accept this case before the end of this year. We'll see if they do, but this is not going to slow down. If you are a broker, there's a possibility that you can be held liable if a motor carrier does something catastrophic. And that is something that you need to be aware of, because these circuit splits, they're just getting started. There's a lot more to come.
And that's a good point, because C.H. Robinson is essentially laying themselves out on the line. They say, hey, we have been found the winner here in this case. Why not take it to the highest court in the land? TQL not so lucky, because they were in fact found liable by the Sixth Circuit. That ruling was handed down just last week. Can you dig into that just a little bit and kind of what that means? Because it was actually an earlier TQL victory that was overturned, and now we're seeing the liability go back into the hands of this broker.
My heart goes out to the victims of any of these catastrophic injuries. They're terrible. And if you're a judge and you're looking at the facts, you see a motor carrier who might not have been super safe, not enough insurance to cover the terrible effects. The Sixth Circuit case had to deal with the death of a child, and God forbid any parent ever has to encounter that. But the motor carrier doesn't have enough resources to make the victim, the plaintiff, whole. We can't bring back the dead. All we can do in civil litigation is exchange money. And they look at TQL and they say that is a broker who has hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars available for potential recovery. They should be held at fault. If it wasn't for them, that driver never would have been there. And I understand that argument. So the Sixth Circuit takes this case up. They look at the facts, they look at the law, and they say, our state has a desire for safety, and our belief is we regulate safety through negligence. And so F4A has this little carve out that allows you to get past the preemption and then go directly at the broker and say, this is your responsibility too. So that's what the Sixth Circuit case is about. The same general set of facts. A motor carrier has a really horrifying accident. There's really no way to get a judgment out of that small motor carrier. And they look at the billion-dollar brokerages and say, someone has to pay. It might as well be you. And I get that feeling. It is horrifying to see these types of accidents. But ultimately, the law is the law. We cannot have every single circuit have different interpretations of a statute that has the exact same words. This will go to the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court goes on the side of the Seventh and overturns the Sixth, but only time will tell.
So we've talked a little bit about the conflicting decisions and why they're so important from the legal perspective, but I want to bring it into the actual industry's perspective and what makes it actionable for the people who are dealing with this every single day, right? Because now if you're watching this from a broker perspective, if you're a mega broker like C.H. Robinson and TQL, or if you're maybe even a small mom and pop shop, you're setting this and you're still sitting in a period of uncertainty saying, I don't know how I can operate if I don't know if I'm going to be held liable or not. Why is this important for the folks who are just trying to figure out how to plan their business and who don't have the massive amounts to protect themselves from nuclear verdicts should something go wrong? And can you talk a little bit about how that ties into the entire conversation about carrier vetting and making sure that you are using people who are properly licensed, who are properly trained, who have a good safety record?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start by saying this. Nothing that I say here is meant to be legal advice. Do not take
Of course.
legal advice from a television show. I'm just a lawyer. If you think you need a lawyer, you probably do. It's not me. That being said, if I'm a broker, these types of cases, this is not a bad day. This is your business is done. This is catastrophic. Bet the farm. You lose, you die. That is the case for motor carriers in these big accidents. It's the case for brokers too. You have to treat your contracts and your business like anyone does with the truck or the trailer. You have to get them inspected periodically. Someone needs to review what insurance policies you have. They need to make you aware of what liability is changing. I have spoken to leaders of mega brokerages who do not fully understand what broker liability could mean for their business. But it's more than that. So many motor carriers have a division that does brokerage. So many shippers have a division that does some level of brokerage. This exposes you to liability that you only thought the asset-based people had the possibility to get hit by. So you have to treat your contracts and your business with preventative maintenance. You need people to look at what's going on, because if you're not paying attention, you'll get a lawyer, maybe not me, probably someone different, who will get their claws into you, put you under deposition, and figure out whether you followed the process and procedures you're supposed to, or if you deviated. And when we have so many motor carriers in the United States that have absolutely no information available on the FMCSA, you have to be aware of the liability in front of you. This is not a bug. This is a feature of our system. So you have to be aware of what is at stake. Right now, like I mentioned, the Ninth Circuit and the Sixth Circuit, you have Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee, as well as Alaska, Arizona, California, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. Those states, if you have an accident as a broker, you might be at fault. So get ready. It's not going to slow down. We need SCOTUS to take this case up. We need clarity.
And I wanted to add to that because, I'm thinking as well that the state Supreme Court in Texas, the Werner, that lawsuit got rescinded. When we're looking at these states now I'm in Tennessee, some states have a percentage of who's at fault. So I'm curious now, if there's a catastrophic accident, normally they would, if they're faulting the motor carrier, does that mean now out of the sandwich of potential pain, the broker gets set in? Because we've seen instances where they go after the truck trailer, the trailer maker, the OEM trying to claw back damages. Is there a really bad potential where now with this state, until the Supreme Court rules, that you may be liable for millions of dollars because they're trying to climb up the chain because carriers don't have enough insurance anymore? And so you got to find ways to get that kind of, what's the term, made whole again in the fancy legalese.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Werner case, it's absolutely fascinating. This case the act was 2014. We're talking over 10 years of litigation, but they eventually did get vindicated at the Texas Supreme Court. The question still goes back to everybody's biggest and favorite topic, proximate cause. Did this thing happen because of your actions? And so Werner, though they had some mistakes that they had made, that was not what caused this accident. But if you are a plaintiff attorney, you are going to sue the trucking company, the driver, the equipment manufacturer, the equipment lessor. You're going to go after the broker, maybe even the shipper, because ultimately most people do not have enough insurance. And even if they do, joint and several liability is at stake. And what joint and several liability stands for is that if you are responsible for part of the damage, you can be made to pay all of the money. So this is why it's so important for people to understand that just because you're not the major cause of this thing, you certainly can be on the hook for most of the damages. So again, you have to be very careful of what you're doing, because ultimately brokers are not guarantors of the safety performance of motor carriers, but increasingly states and federal circuits are saying, yeah, we kind of think that they are.
So, Matt, let's kind of try and wrap this all together into something that ends up being actionable for the industry as a whole, right? Obviously, you're talking about adopting F4A, which, as you mentioned at the very beginning, is an industry, or is an aviation, interpretation of this regulation. Is there a point now where the industry has to look and say, okay, we need to start petitioning for something that is specific to the trucking industry because of not just the way that we operate, but because of the scope of intermediaries, right? You have anyone can pop up and get their operating authority and become a carrier. Anyone can pop up and get their broker's authority. It's the barrier to entry is very, very low. The barrier to entry to becoming a pilot is much higher. So when we're talking about this industry that has such a low barrier of entry, do we need to start looking at how we rework maybe the entire regulation as a whole to make it industry specific and thus easier to enforce?
I'm an incrementalist. I don't think anything needs to be done in a broad, sweeping way. What we really need, and this is why I think I'm so encouraged by folks like the TIA, as well as the ATA to an extent, is their participation in this type of litigation. What we're going to see happen over the next few weeks is looking at this idea of what they call friends of the court, amicus briefs. These are basically legal documents filed by people who are not part of this litigation, but are asking for the courts to weigh in. So I expect with this C.H. Robinson appeal, as well as what we'll definitely see in the Cox case out of the Sixth Circuit, is that maybe TIA and other organizations get on and start asking the courts to make review. I'll use the Werner case as a great example. Werner went on appeal to the Texas Supreme Court. The oral argument was in December 3rd of 2024. But if you look at who else filed briefs, like to ask the court to think about issues, Schneider was there. U.S. Chamber of Commerce was there. American Trucking Associations were there. They were asking the court to look at things from their perspective as well. So even though Robinson and Global Trans and everyone else, they're all vicious competitors in trying to get freight for their customers, this is something that brings the industry together. We need to have less unpredictability in how laws are interpreted and how laws are enforced. So I don't think you have to rip everything away and start from scratch. I think you keep what you have, but you get it in front of the right people. And I hope this Supreme Court, if they take this case up, I would suspect it's going to be 6-3, maybe 5-4, but probably 6-3, upholding what the Seventh Circuit has done in the C.H. Robinson case, which is to say brokers are not going to be liable for the negligence of motor carriers. That's my belief. And I think that's how we as an industry come together, is to work with our interest groups, with our lobbying organizations, with our representatives, and explain what the issue is and why it matters. Because this is only going to be more expensive for American consumers. It's going to be more expensive for brokers to operate if you find a way where they can ultimately be held responsible for something that they have zero control over.
And if folks want to get their voices heard, we are seeing a upswell on social media looking at carrier safety, trying to identify accidents and stuff. So for the brokerages as well, what would you recommend, folks? Do you just write a congressman, call a senator? What are some of these ways? Because unless you're part of a larger association or with a big legal team, the average Joe doesn't really always have the opportunity. So what would you say for folks who really want to get involved and help, kind of like you said, get their voice heard, so that way whenever this stuff does go to the highest court of the land, hopefully we can get a little more color to the situation and have a better outcome?
We have more tools in our disposal than we have ever had in the history of humanity. We have people in government that are watching social media, learning about what people think in terms of these topics and understanding where the pendulum swings. Transportation is a $1 trillion a year domestic industry. We need to punch at our weight class, which is significant. These cases directly impact everything that comes on a truck and every intermediary involved. So if you're a small broker, the things I would recommend that you do is talk to local legislative officials if you can, or chambers of commerce if you're a member of those things. But the folks like the TIA and the ATA, they need to know what your opinion is, because they are responsible to reach out on your behalf. You pay the dues, have them do the work. This F4A preemption is the most important legal issue facing brokerages today. I don't care if you think cargo theft and fraud is the biggest issue. It's important, but this is the kind of stuff that if you lose one of these cases, whatever you have built is gone. It is gone. You cannot recover it. And even if you win ultimately, like Werner did, you might spend millions of dollars fighting and you'll never recover that. So we need people to get energized, to talk about this issue, and maybe tweet at the Supreme Court and say, hey, you should take on this Montgomery case, or you should take on this C.H. Robinson case, because they are listening as far as I can tell.
As far as we can tell, hopefully. Matt, thank you for being here. Always such a joy. You mentioned these two cases, the most important things we've got going on in the freight industry right now, but we got a couple minutes. What else are you watching? What else is going on in the space where you're like, hey, this is something that we really need to pay attention to? Is it fraud? Are we talking about English language proficiency? What's most important here?
For me, it's really focusing on the existing regulations. English language proficiency, that's something. Vehicle maintenance is super important. I am waiting for the FMCSA to come out and say broker transparency is gone and dead. There's no reason for the FMCSA to be staring at contracts and saying whether or not you've given the person the right amount of information. Broker transparency, in my mind, is outside the scope of the FMCSA, which is about safety. And if you're paying attention, 20% or more of every commercial vehicle on the road right now, if you stopped it and looked at it, would not pass the minimum safety standards of the FMCSA. That's brakes, that's tires, that's lights. Those are the things that keep me up at night. Fraud is important, cargo theft is important, but vehicle maintenance, take care of your trucks and trailers.
And they should keep you up at night. We talked about that the first 2 days of this week. Matt Leffel, everybody, the Armchair Attorney, thank you so much for joining us. Go give him a follow on LinkedIn. Go give him a follow on Twitter. We'll see you at F3 this year. We got some cool things coming down the pipe, and you might put on your judge's hat, not just your attorney's hat for once.
I'm so excited. That's going to be amazing. I will do my best to fulfill my mandate.
I love it, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.
Thanks again.
All right, Thomas, so we're going to wrap it up. Speaking of F3, everybody's favorite thing to be there for is the Freight Tech 25 announcement. It's the top 25 companies that are in our space making waves, making headlines. Last year, we had quite the large shakeup in companies that ended up winning our Freight Tech 25. The first step to get you to an FT25 winner opens today. Our Freight Tech 100 nominations have officially dropped. You can go to FreightWaves.com and we can get your nominations in, get them submitted. Freight Tech 25 works by nominating your company. We take that, we break it down to our top 100. We send that top 100 out to an outside consulting agency. They decide who are the winners. So go get those in today. Was there anyone who made the list last year, Thomas, that was surprising to you?
Oh, man. We had a few. Was it Happy Robot or Hey Bubba?
Happy Robot.
Happy Robot. Happy Robot. God, shout out to the guys at Happy Robot. I saw them at a Samsara event as well. There's so much cool stuff going in the space. I'm really excited to see this new breed of freight technology. It used to be visibility. It used to be all the TMS stuff. Now we're finally getting to see some cool little AI stuff. And it's fascinating to watch. I think Christian Thomas has a voice on one of those too.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, FreightWaves.com. Go submit yourself, submit your friends, submit your mom, submit your dog. I don't care. Go submit your favorite company for your Freight Tech 100 nomination. It's going to be here before you know it. That's it for What the Truck today. Thank you guys for sticking with us here on this Monday morning. You can catch us live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon Eastern right here on FreightWaves TV. You can hear us on FreightWaves Drive Time Radio, channel 146 Sirius XM. We'll see you guys Wednesday. Don't be a stranger.